Okay, so let's do a story applicable to other life history situations, but people are familiar with this, so I'll make reference to it. There's a story in scripture. Jesus makes reference to this. When the religious leaders and the legal authorities and whatnot were coming at Jesus, and they're like really upset about movement stirring people's hearts and whatnot. They have all these different ways to like counteract and utilize the law or technicalities or, things like that. And it also portrays when various ones legitimately don't know how to, they call it legalistic. So when people have a legalistic mind is when they kind of get stuck on seeing things as just entirely black and white. It becomes a function of their personality, and it's difficult to break out of or to understand a path to break out of it. And I think this is why even the Apostle Paul, much later on, is able to develop some tangible ways to understand breaking out of a legalistic viewpoint in the world, because he says he was one of them. And so when he's starting to deliver some of his philosophical proposals and teachings, he's saying, believe me, I was one that obeyed things down to the letter of the law. I understood it that way. That's how I functioned. I know the experience, and so I know what it's like to have a breakthrough and transition through it. I think about that sometimes. Paraphrase, whatever. I think about that sometimes because even some of the things that I do, I feel like generally in life I've been, pretty flexible with ideas and beliefs, and trying to look at like the compassionate aspect of selecting for life and whatnot, the conditions by which things are functioning. But there are those portions though that people get stuck in when they look at the legalistic aspect of stuff, like the down to the letter, right? And so that's kind of one of these conundrums when some people try to discern between whether it's philosophical, theoretical trade of ideas, logic, religiosity, the holy law, stuff like that. Anyway, I'm not going to do like a whole spiel on this, just some of these topics. This story, right? So Jesus makes reference to this story where he talks about when David, because they all know David, King David. He's like, when he and his fighting men, when they were in battle and whatnot, and then they broke into this, or they took some level of sanctuary or something to that effect in this like temple area. And in general, the moral code or the consensus was that you can't eat this holy bread, this certain type of bread, right? That it was set up for this certain condition. And in that sense, though, in that other situation, when the context had shifted and he and his men were starving and they were in the middle of combat, then he eats the bread, right? And then at the time, even those within the temple and various ones that understood the context of what was going on, they kind of just knew, right? They knew the situation. And so it is something interesting to consider, because then he makes reference to it among those that are caught up in the time, because in the condition that they're at that stage of civilizations or systems where it reaches a point where some people within the system that is not quite aligned properly. There's all sorts of different versions of systems that you can diagnose as becoming closed or lording over people, or, whether it be some, various versions, right? Like masculine or feminine, or just whoever at the time has gained some type of enclosures of power and leverage of power, right? And so they're in that condition, and they're starting to develop that consciousness among the people that are more oppressed, where they're just reading into the ideas of they understand the conditions. And so they also understand the conditions of people imposing certain financial apparatuses around them and legal codes and jargon. And it goes all the way up to the heights of the establishment. And so they know that also, right? And so they're like, yeah, we get it. We see, how do we discern between this? Because we tend to know that there's incorrect, corrupt, outright corrupt things going on, and it's just imposed upon us all the way down, right? Anyway, so they're talking about these things, and so Jesus brings up that story, and he's kind of saying, in that moment, was David wrong? And so some people would think, of course he's wrong, because it's just off limits. It's, you never touch the bread, you never eat the bread. And so then Jesus says, but at that moment they weren't in the wrong, right? And then they try to mull over this question, like, why? How so? How can you discern between the context? But anyway, as I'm thinking about it, I think about people generally tend to think at some level, when they kind of get into a legalistic mindset, generally a law, it has a standard. There's a certain point, a standard, the criterion. And then from there is these branching off of these codes, these moral codes, discerning between the sides, the scales, right? Kind of gauging between the condition. And at some point, people generally tend to think that every system that becomes its own lord or dominion over people is somehow its own standard of pure justification, pure standard. But then when it starts to become skewed, off base, based upon their own imagery of their own power, then it isn't a standard unto God. And so eventually it's corrupted, right? And so at some level you think, okay, when it is corrupted, then you can't assume that everything is exactly lined up for the proper situation unto whatever it's espousing to be. It's skewed. But if you look at it in story form, for instance, like that situation, look at it as a story. So in practice, you could say, what was skewed there? So in general, the general idea of compliance to the temple and the certain protocol within the temple was, all things considered, just the general regular status of life, right? The expectation of all things kind of regular context unto the people. In that context, in that condition, to keep the spirit and purpose of the temple going, there's certain protocol. So when society is functional, when it's this regular setting and condition, that protocol is functional for different degrees of learning into what the spirit and the intent of those different protocols can produce, right? But in a whole different context, when things are not regular, when there isn't a social norm, when it's warfare, when the standard is death, when, then the social code shifts. It's like, there's a standard of death going on right now. The regular protocol, even if we abided by the protocol, would not preserve the temple, nor would it preserve us, nor would it be preserving that bread. So under these circumstances, there's a conflict battle going on. And so you have to gauge between a skewed system and death. And so they then eat the bread. Other times, though, when the system tries to come in and trick Jesus and impose a certain standard as though everything was normal, as though it wasn't under this kind of rampant death skewed criteria of actual functional occupying death, Jesus starts to call them out, what about this and that and that and this and that? And then they get upset because they want to believe that the system is functioning regular in the spirit of what it's for the maintenance of delegation and protocol for the people, but it isn't. And when it gets to the point where it's these technicalities and expectations where they refuse to look at the actual conditions, the actual occupying exploitative forces, then it's just these technicalities, right? And then you have to gauge between what increases life. At some point you could say, okay, I know this legal jargon is useful for proper delegation and distribution, engaging and all of these different things for people. If things were actually functioning unto the expectation of what that criteria is on behalf of people, but it isn't. And so now it's being misused and misapplied to actually be corrosive to people, to create barriers for people, to make it more difficult for people. And so it's not even abiding by its own protocol. That'd be like saying the bread is not even in the temple anymore. You think it's in the temple, but there's no protocol functioning there that it's even to the temple. And it's not even producing the effect of the societal expectation. So the bread is right there. The people are at war, and the temple's not behaving like a temple. So what standard are you really talking about or making reference to? It seems like you're trying to pretend this theater show as though everyone says the emperor has closed and these certain mechanisms are working, but they're actually not. And you're upset with people making strategic decisions for the sake of diminishing the conflict and increasing life. And that makes you upset because you think that's what you're supposed to be doing. But that's not to say that it could never work. That's not to say that, oh, so are you saying the protocols in the temple never can be functional? It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Like, it's in function with other aspects, all things being at least mostly functional, but it isn't. And so, anyway, that's just kind of one of those things where it's like, if people really want full transparency about things, about the measures of occupying force and the standards of death that are actually really rampant in some of these skewed technicalities, they could be fully transparent, but a lot of times they don't want to be fully transparent. They just want little isolated technicalities so they can kind of corner people into situations because they just don't intend for it to work and function by the spirit or standard by which it should be functioning anyway. They like the idea of pretending that it's about life or the increase or favor or success or justice, but a lot of times when they get into the mode where they can't discern between the spirit of situations going on, they just seem to get upset about that. That's not to say, though, that other people put in the line of fire by these technicalities are not also being weaponized or, like being oppressed, because the other legalities will put other people in the position because they're doing that to them too. For instance, like when Peter goes, Peter's hanging out with Jesus, right? Peter's like trying to figure out the ropes, and they come to Peter like, well, Peter, isn't your guru here, whatever his name is, I'm sure they probably say some kind of slur or whatever, aren't they supposed to be paying taxes and doing all of this stuff? Like, what about that? And then Peter's just like, oh, they're gonna get me trapped in this too. Like, I know they're after me and they're after you and they're trying to use the legalities of the system. And then Jesus is like, oh, good thing you brought that up. There's a couple stories to talk about in relation to this. And so then that's that whole story about like, well, the actual standard going on here is not quite legit. Let's talk about the standard, da-da-da-da-da. So there's that story about the whole like, well, if we really want to talk about correcting the standard by which we're making these exacting comparisons, let's do that. But I don't think that that's what they want to talk about. So anyway, he's just like, thank you for bringing it up. I know they're going to hold that over your head just like they expect to hold it over my head. But anyway, it's still a mystery, I guess, to people as to how to build a system that's functional around bread and the context by which we just have some more free standards and criteria, but systems rise and fall and we shift chairs around and then we reemerge with some of these difficulties and riddles and whatnot. And so anyway, that just seems to be one of those things where Jesus talks about that a lot. That's why the law and whatnot is a huge aspect of the stories with Jesus, because it gets to the point where the idea of the law starts functioning without the spirit of it and the actual corrective measures of expectation, and it starts to be transferred, putting pressure on everyone as the system feels that tension and starts trying to leverage it rather than shift it and meet the needs of people and whatnot. And so then it just starts imposing all of these technicalities on people. So that's a huge aspect as to why Jesus starts talking about the law. He frees it into being kind of like, to get to that freeing point, he has to kind of start really showing and portraying living in that spirit and that standard within, because all things are going to start being critiqued, like around him and whatnot. So I still feel like it's a pretty interesting story of seeing a character just kind of like really refine themselves, like fall into what that means to be in that certain standard and to the mystery of life and whatnot, and then see the shifting of all this stuff going on around you. So that's kind of, where it starts to come up in scripture. It's not as though it gets into all this like legal jargon where it's like, it's not as though the law is never good, because it can be functional. If there's a certain criteria and whatnot, it can be functional. Certain delegations and whatnot can help kind of bring things together. And then that helps us to have some level of stability. Whereas if it's in the context of being a technicality to just gloss over the hemorrhaging of society and the standard of death and the rampant warfare and looking the other way on such a massive scale, then it's like you're just trying to put this Band-Aid over something just to hide it. You're not using the law for the mechanism of unearthing those things to bring a better standard of life to it. And so then he talks about eventually that standard or the legalities are actually a direct hindrance to life and actually start functioning to participate with death. And so he starts saying, the law was made for man. Man is not made just for the law. Like we are, and then to add to that, well, what does that mean? Well, people infer a lot of different things, but it's kind of like the law in itself is not going to be the end all be all. It can start just kind of sterilizing people if they stick to it and they don't think of the spirit of what the context is for, what it equips you to help see. And then when you see it, to be that change. But if you don't do that, then you're just a hindrance unto it. And it just can be increasingly corrosive and used for the very thing that it was, supposed to help to see. It becomes used for destruction and destroying the very thing that it was supposed to enable being able to see. And so the whole legal jargon, that was a tongue twister. So the whole legal jargon, though, is just kind of like, there's a usefulness of it. But when you're in relationship, these are just technicalities to make sure that everybody at least has some general idea for being able to be a part of communion. There's some flexibility and nuance to it. But if people, start imposing all of these other things just so that they can make more functional use of the lingering oppression, then that's actually the standard that's what they're doing. That's their intent. That's the spirit by which they're functioning. If people make their standard in the system of death and they allow it to chisel away people's lives and become corrosive, then they're really trying to rule in death. And if they're, and so this is where eventually it talks about misuse of the law unto a system that is not by the spirit of life or the spirit of the law, is the freedom that you see in some of the message of Jesus, where he says, like, we situate it, we've shifted it, we've put it in check, we've situated it into the standard of life. And where there is life, then we also have this ability for these stages of increase of life. If you start to realize some of these technicalities that have this language where they could use the law to point toward that, they refuse to, because they've situated the law into a standard of death. And so where there is a standard of death, what really is the spirit by which their motivation is? We could technically enter into some of those legal codes and say, hey, you have the ability with these legal codes to increase life from your standard of death and then be situated to increase unto a standard of life. But when it really gets down to it and there becomes too much life, you seem to feel threatened. And so then you try to impose upon it some kind of like technicalities. But then we can really ask you, what in the grand scheme of things are you actually functioning through? So that's why I say, at some level you have to look at what are these legalities causing you to perpetuate? That's actually the system by which you are anchored in. And is that true? Is it true that death ultimately reigns and there's no mechanism to improve life? That is not true. What's true is that death does not have to reign and there are mechanisms to increase life. And then once you increase even more life, you should have the spirit of wanting to increase more life. So why don't you? But anyway, so these are seems like there was some inferences, whatever. And I thought, oh, I guess it's time to talk about the law. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in the law. I just try to love people. I just try to, I've tried for a long time to negotiate with like scripture and increase the abilities for life to, have more freedom and people to have their personal freedoms. I try not to impose ideas of whether it be like forcing marriage on them or forcing this other stuff on them. Just personal freedoms anchored in life, the increase of love, abilities for them to understand, and then it just shakes off all these other oppressive aspects of things. And then a system by which can function through better strategies pertaining to some of those attributes. If that makes it seem like I'm this perpetual villain, then I don't know, like where your standard of being a villain is. Like if I'm a villain to the system of death, then that's peculiar. And if you're the villain to the system of life, that's also peculiar. But anyways, doesn't it say something like in scripture says, see, I stand before thee, something, 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 life and death, choose life, something to that effect. Anyway, I'm going to go for now. Oh yeah, there was another thing I was going to add. What do they call that? The little encore, well, the bloopers maybe. So I think also, one of the aspects, so when you're breaking down this idea, because there's a lot that can go into this, people legitimately do wonder and ponder about like, because there's a lot of things that happen throughout the story where they do seem like they're supposed to abide within this certain like criteria of the law. And so they obtain that, influence. And so that's what also makes it difficult for them to discern between the times. I do think there are other mechanisms that were at work there, not as though God is imposing those, but that the powers impose some of those, that criteria, and the law helps them to discern between it so they can increase life, hoping to at least. But going back to that question, though, the story about when Jesus eats the bread, people might still feel like, I don't know, though. It just still feels wrong because it just seems like even if you do, let's just say someone comes in after the fact, they get out of war and there's a combat zone and they're going through and they're looking through the ruins and they're like, somebody was in here and ate this bread. That's a weird criteria to have in terms of the whole conditions or whatever. But let's just say they do. They go in and they're like, somebody took a picture of you. It's on TikTok, like Jesus was eating the bread, or whatever. And then Jesus goes before the courts and they're like, word on the street is that you were in the temple during the conflict and you ate the bread and whatever. It's like, first of all, do you even care about the other people? But anyway, whatever. Okay, sure. Okay, so we ate the bread. And so he's like, we went in there, these were the conditions and we ate the bread. And then they're like, well, they're like, okay, look, all things being like, even if it was fair, it wasn't, but let's just imagine it is. Like, this is like a kangaroo court, right? And then he's like, well, if, he's like, okay, what's the law in relation to it? Like, not that it's like you eat the bread and it's going to destroy the temple because the conditions were already destructive, or not that like you eat the bread and it's going to destroy the people because there was already like destruction going on. It's just the bread, like, right? And so I kind of figured like, okay, according to like just the bread in terms of these conditions, if I eat it and if you come back and press charges that I ate it, then the legal agreement is like, I'll just buy you some more bread. And so they're like, okay, then buy us some more bread. It's like, okay, sure. I just felt like in the conditions, all things the same, like there's certain seasons of opportunity. At that moment, I just thought, well, we might not ever get this chance again because, death or whatever. So let's just eat the bread. And so they're like, well, now, though, we are going to press charges on you. And it's like, well, can you put that in your legal document, the whole condition? Like, let's just do the whole report. Like, write out the whole conditions by which you're even here asking me this. And like, let's let that go into the legal system. And they're like, no, we don't want to do that. This is a technicality. Like, just, and then he's like, fine, I'll buy you some more bread. I'll buy you some more bread. And then, obviously, that's probably going to get them mad because they're just like, this is a slight against your character or whatever. Actually, it isn't. I think the whole reign of death is affecting my mood. But anyway, so there's that story, right? He's like, believe you me, I would be fine had there not been that like provoked tension, and I would have came in here and chilled while the priests just did their thing, and I would enjoy just leaving the bread there. Like, all honesty, like that would be great. Was that the situation though? That wasn't. You know, just like in our own personal lives, we could say, hey, all things, you know, being generally for the most part, like somewhat functioning equally and according to justice, I could see the reasoning of that functioning pretty well. Like, everyone come in here, peaceful measures, enjoy the service, leave that bread alone. Fine, totally fine. I agree. But until we can get to that opportunity, if you're going to chase me up there, whatever, with the whole herd mentality, you know, or whatever, like, maybe I'll eat the bread. But anyway, so just to kind of go through the whole, like, I guess, protocol of, you know, questioning some of those things. But then Jesus was probably like, well, it wasn't really me, it was David. But let's be honest. I think what's interesting though, because yeah, that was David's men, and he was probably like, no, it was my men. They were eating the bread. I was just looking out for them. Anyway, though, that's beside the point. Something happened there under his influence. Jesus is like, what am I leading a rebellion? Anyway, so I think along those lines, though, if you were kind of bringing like the legal standard or whatever, Jesus is probably like, yeah, if you are going to still impose legalities, then in terms of the situation and the event, you know, I still, because of other conditions out of the control, had decided to, you know, like, if it gets to that point, you want to impose some kind of fee that, like, now you owe us for this bread, you know. Okay. And maybe David, it wasn't Jesus telling the story. David, like, telling story about David, he's like, in that situation, then you just kind of gauge the conditions that you're in. And it kind of says a lot, though, about, you know, a group, if they want to go into a war zone and be like, you knocked over this vase over here or whatever. It's like, yes, but would I have if you hadn't, like, charged in and did all of this, like, death anthem stuff and these occupying forces and whatnot? Like, the legalities of it are kind of strange. The nitpicking and the choice of emphasis is pretty peculiar and says a lot. And then on top of that, the refusal to say the actual conditions of how it had occurred is a strange technicality that really undermines, like, the whole reasoning for some of this situation even being there. Like, why even have a temple in the first place? Like, why even have any of that stuff in the first place if it's not really for, you know, the context of the whole larger picture of things going on? And then to not even want to document the full story and these whole legalities, charades and stuff like that, you know? Anyway, that was just a side note. It was just kind of a no, saying, no, but what if there really is, you know, or whatever. Even on that note, for the lawyers in the room, because I'm not a lawyer, but if, I'm just an idea person, but if, isn't there, like, catastrophic, you know, like, there's, situations where it's like, this is a war criteria, this is catastrophic, or this is, like, a natural disaster, or these are, like, other forces and conditions going on, you know, what have you. Because I do think at some level, the legalities, the framework of a legal code is for some sense of stability and the increase of that certain standards of the law being able to be inhabited within people as it relationally plays out in outward practice, so that it's like an inward, you know, manifestation of relational dynamics. But if it's in a war zone and you're forcing people to enact certain charades of trade in a war zone, isn't that just going to internalize in them a standard of saying, oh, the charades of this are, like, prioritized over lives? And is that what the law is supposed to do? I don't think so. I mean, I think you're supposed to, the law is there so you prioritize lives so that you can internalize prioritizing lives. And so if the law is there to not prioritize lives and to diminish lives, then why is it even there? So then the question is like, okay, I'll pay you the bread back, but why is that even there then? For what reason? Could we follow that back? And you probably wouldn't want to, because eventually sometimes it's a technicality to wage against populations, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be like that. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. This time for real.